it's absolutely a pleasure to have you here with us today. We'll quickly start with the program, and we want to keep true to ourselves as Institute for Competitiveness, as thinkers, that we'll start on time, come whatever may. So that's how it is. I think people are getting delayed because of traffic or whatever, but everybody will be coming in as we go along. So that's where it is. So today what we are doing is that we have this congregation of one of the finest minds in the area of economics from the country. We have people like Uday, who has written something on Mr. Modi as the Prime Minister and his governance issues. We have Professor Arun Kumar, who's been one of the foremost economic thinkers in the country, who's there with us. We have people like Bibek, Debroy, who are sharing their views, and so on and so forth. So we have the best minds here who are actually coming and sharing their views today. So this is for the first time that we've actually had a congregation of this sort, wherein all of these people are coming together. In fact, the only person who's not in person here with us but has a video is Bibek Debroy, but everybody else is there with us in person today. Bibek had to fly to Singapore because of his some state visit that came up, so can't avoid it. So the governmental matters take precedence on everything else. So that is where it is. So we have a small video from him. It's a small snippet. We did a very interesting interview with him day before yesterday. It's a 30-minute interview, but what we'll do is we'll just show you a snippet of about 8 minutes, and then you can actually look at the complete thing later. And rest of the things will actually flow on time. We'll have Shubda, who will do the keynote, who's again an expert in the area of Indian economy. She's going to talk about broad levels of competitiveness and so on and so forth. So as we go along, I'll share more about the program, but there's one very exciting thing that we are doing today, and that is that we are launching the list of 50 most influential thinkers in the area of economics and governance. And I have to say my thanks to Yes Bank here, which actually enabled this whole exercise. And I have to put it on record that Penguin has been an amazing support for really bringing this together. So I have to thank two people, that is Millie Ashwarya, who's the editor there, and Preeti, who's sitting here in the middle. And of course, I always tell Preeti, you were so irritating, but it was just lovely working with you because of the way things happened and how we were able to pull it off. This whole program is also going live on YouTube, Periscope, Facebook, and we have Times, which is covering it. We have BTV, who's covering it, and so on and so forth. So without further ado, I would just request to play this short video from Dr. Debroy.
I think the way to look at governance is to interpret it in a specific Indian context. And the reason I'm saying this is because the word governance is widely used and it's widely abused. All kinds of people use that expression without necessarily always pinning down and making precise what they mean by that expression. It is impossible to appreciate governance in the post-1947 or post-1950 Indian context without appreciating the Constitution, which is a federal constitution, and I'm not using the word federal in a strictly legal sense. A lot of what needs to be delivered as a public good or service is not delivered by the union government. It's sometimes delivered by state governments. It's sometimes even delivered by local governments, although local governments still don't have a role in terms of the 7th schedule to the Constitution. So to appreciate governance and how you can improve governance in India, it's important to appreciate the constitutional structure. It is important to appreciate the nature of public administration, because after all, the delivery, for better or for worse, of any particular government scheme is contingent on public administration, which does not mean only the all India services, because the cutting edge or the blunting edge is often at the level of the blocks and even lower down. So one has to look at it not from a top-down perspective, but a bottom-up perspective, from the perspective of the 600,000 odd villages that we have got. I would say that we need to step back even more, and we need to ask, what do we expect governments, and I'm using the word government in the plural because there are 3 tiers of government. There's the union government, there's the state government, and there's the local body. We need to prioritize and ask, what do we expect governments to do? There is a tendency to expect that the governments should do everything. It is not possible for governments to do everything. Governments have limited fiscal capacity, governments have limited administrative capacity, and therefore governments need to focus on key issues. There are always opportunity costs, but when it comes to government, we tend to think that there are no opportunity costs of either fiscal resources or administrative capacity. Given the limited fiscal and administrative capacity, we need to set out that 1, 2, 3, 4, these are the things that we want the government to do, prioritization. And to my mind, item number 1 should be law and order and security. That's why governments exist. Number 2, certain items of physical infrastructure. Number 3, certain items of social infrastructure. If these are delivered, I think we'll get that focus to governance. And I think one of the problems with governance, however defined in India, has been that we've expected governments would do too many different things. Every country has a certain historical context and a certain specific condition. Having said that, there is a critical difference between the government financing something and the government actually providing something. It is perfectly possible for the government to finance people who within quotes are below the poverty line. I don't even want to get into a debate about what the poverty line should be, but people who are deprived, it is perfectly possible for the government to say that, hey, look, I need to subsidize these people. But that does not necessarily mean that the best way of delivering, let us say, educational outcomes is through the government running educational institutes. Now, don't get me wrong, because I'm not trying to drive the point beyond what is reasonable, because I mentioned the 600,000 villages. There would be some villages where, at least today, there are what economists would classically call market failures. So there are supply side problems. But the point I'm making is, you take any of the service sectors. Quite often we tend to think after 1991, there has been liberalization in India and entry barriers have been removed. That's largely true of manufacturing. It's not true of many of the service sectors. For example, you take things like education and health. Look at the number of licenses you still need. And there's been a historical confusion between licensing and regulation. Regulation is always necessary, but licensing is not necessarily desirable. Now, what I therefore mean is there are areas where the government, I think, can vacate the space for the private sector. And the private sector does not necessarily mean the private corporate sector. Indeed, it does not. To vacate that area, which will allow the government the flexibility to focus on the things it needs to focus on. Well, partly it depends on which sector we are talking about. You can sort of set out certain criteria, which are broad brush criteria in terms of a template. One is the regulator needs to be truly, truly independent of government, hands off, which brings one to the question of how the regulator is financed. Does it have an independent budget? Is it contingent on another ministry, another department? Third is, how do we choose the regulator, meaning the human resource part of it? Because one of the biggest problems has been getting hold of people with the requisite expertise. You don't necessarily want people who are from within government or ex-government. You want lateral entry from outside also. That's easier said than done. Now, these are essentially the critical elements in setting up the regulator. The independence, the independent budget, the independent appointment and even removal, and the regulator's powers. Beyond this, depending on the sector, you sometimes need a little bit of technical expertise. The regulator you would want for the railways is not necessarily the same as the regulator you would want for something like higher education. Because what does the word governance mean? I earlier said that people use that word indiscriminately. There are definitions of governance that float around, be they from the EU, the OECD, the World Bank, the UNDP. Cutting across all of these complicated definitions, you will find one critical element, and that is that governance is also about participation in the decision-making process. And because governance has participation in the decision-making process, we use the word governance as opposed to government. Otherwise, the two words would have simply been synonyms. Now, what I'd like to draw everyone's attention to is the preamble to the Constitution. The preamble to the Constitution says, "We the people." It does not say the government. The reason I'm flagging this is I do not think governance in India can improve if we expect government alone to improve it. Governance, development, all of these things in India will improve only when citizens become participants in that process. And one of the problems for a very, very long time has been partly because of the colonial legacy, and because that tended to be perpetuated, there has been this we-they, almost like Joseph Heller. That needs to break down, because India cannot improve only based on the efforts of the three tiers of government.